Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where we are talking to the man who is in charge of all things missile defense here, Tom Karako. Thanks very much for joining us, Tom.
It's great to be on the Defense and Aerospace Report.
I want to start with the test that the United States has done. A lot of attention has gone in that. You've been talking to folks about that as well, most recently to NPR. Talk to us about the test, what it achieved, and why it was so important.
Right, so this was, I think, yet another important milestone in kind of the overall development of the ground-based mid-course defense system. This is it's a global system, really, spread across 15 time zones, but has interceptors in Alaska and California, and that's what's really designed. It's the only system deployed today to kind of defend the nation against the long-range ICBM-type threat from places like North Korea. So this particular test was of the latest configuration that they're putting in silos today. That are in the ground in Alaska, and by all accounts, it seems to have performed magnificently. This was also, incidentally, the first kind of true ICBM. They've had ICBM speeds, but the target itself was for the true ICBM. This test obviously was successful. You can go and watch the video, the colorful video of the explosion, of the impact. The last test in 2014 was also successful. These two back-to-back things is a good thing. I think kind of what it confirms is that when the Missile Defense Agency back in the 2010 to 2014 timeframe, they had had some failures, and they went back and literally took the kill vehicle apart into its 130,000 constituent pieces, and then put it back together again to figure out what had been going wrong. And I think what you're seeing is with these intercept tests, some other flight tests, and ground tests, a fair degree of confidence that they're on the right path.
And the test missile was a full-up ICBM replicant, right? Replicating exactly the capabilities. It was fired from Kwajalein Atoll. And where were the interceptor shooting from? What was the tracking network like? Walk us through how all these pieces came together.
Right. So as you said, the target ICBM was from Kwaj, and the interceptor was from Vandenberg, California. They have to do the tests from Vandenberg as opposed to from Alaska because Fort Greely's inland, and you don't want stages falling on anybody. So for safety purposes, they always do them from California. Safety is, of course, one of the reasons why there are constraints on the test environment. They do everything they can to make it as challenging and realistic as possible, but they still, whether it's shipping or aircraft lanes from Los Angeles Airport and things like that, they do have restrictions about that. But they went out, the target was launched, and the same warfighters who would be there on a day-to-day basis manning the system were the ones that pulled the trigger to launch the GBI and intercept the target.
Let's talk a little bit about North Korea's missile capabilities at this point. The tests have been accelerating since 2011. You guys have written in your report that was released last month on the missile threat and how to be able to cope with it. Threat 2020, I think you were looking at in the time frame. Missile Defense 2020. Threat 2020, and you won't find that report. But Missile Defense 2020, and you'll find it. The nature of North Korea's tests have been changing. The missiles aren't going as far. They're much shorter, much higher altitude, replicating re-entry speeds, which is, I think, one of the things that has folks concerned. How far away are they from a missile capability that is going to threaten the United States? I was talking to a friend of mine in New York. We were born and raised together, and he is astonishingly surprised and concerned, in part because this crazy country with a nuclear capability is working on rockets to drop them on the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think people are concerned in New York, California, all over the country, and it's not unreasonable. We've been seeing the North Korea problem come for 2 decades, and where they are today is a lot further along than where they have been. As you mentioned, they've been doing sort of different kinds of missiles, more solid-fueled, more mobile. That means that they can kind of launch them really more unexpectedly and on shorter notice. That means they're going to be harder to defeat on the ground. And that's one of the reasons why you need to have a fallback, like an active missile defense, to deal with that. But the kinds of rockets that they've been doing the last couple of years, you mentioned the highly lofted trajectory with the high reentry speed for kind of testing reentry of a warhead. You put all those pieces together, and it matches up, frankly, with what they've been saying about their intent to acquire an ICBM capability. And they certainly seem to be a lot closer than they've ever been before. And so it's I think this kind of confirms the prudence of, frankly, the decision, the development that goes back to the 1990s, but the decision in the early 2000s to deploy something, and that has been sustained now over multiple administrations of different parties, and with lots of different changes in Congress, and I think that really kind of confirms the prudence of that, and it's why we want to stay ahead of the threat. Now, you spoke about kind of timing. In a press conference yesterday, the head of the Missile Defense Agency, Vice Admiral Searing, they don't go into a lot of the details about the targets and things like that. He confirmed that they had decoys. Right, this is not the first time, but it was sort of a complex decoy thing that was in there too, that speaks to kind of the realism. But he also used this. He also says this is the kind of target that we would expect in a 2020 timeframe. It's only 3 years away. Now that's I think was an interesting statement.
And it was also interesting that he mentioned it because opponents of missile defense have always said it's very easily decoyed and spoofed, and so there's no way that an interceptor could do that. So I think that was part of what the Admiral was trying to underscore. Let's go to the U.S. defensive capability. Does the United States now have a capability to defend the nation appropriately? What are the changes that are going to be required to the current system to be able to expand its envelope? And what other missile sites? I know the Obama administration considered that in 2013 in a report on where else in the United States you would need to put interceptor bases. This does harken back to the 1950s where folks had air defense missiles in their neighborhoods, certainly on the coasts. But talk to us a little bit about what this architecture needs to look like and how it needs to adapt and evolve over the next couple of years to give the nation that fully featured defense that I think most folks expect.
Right. So first of all, the first part of your question, I think that this week's test really kind of confirms and reaffirms the confidence that the warfighter has expressed and has been expressed by the last several administrations that yes, there are some reliability improvements and some capability improvements to be had, and I think the agency is on the right path to do that. But having said that, overall the result was very good. And then secondly, on the side of, okay, how might this evolve both in terms of a site thing and in other ways? And I think sometimes it's the pieces that are less seen. It's the sensors, not merely more radars, but also a space sensor layer that every administration, last 5 administrations, has said is kind of essential for national missile defense, but nobody has actually done. That, I think, would be a tremendous boost to this. The better your sensors, the better you are at killing something. But you also alluded to kind of an additional site. And so something is being talked about for kind of the east coast of the United States, kind of improve the overall, you might say, buying battle space, buying time. And so that's something that's still looked at. There is a lot of cost there, and so there are some potential trade-offs. And so we might be looking for some less costly alternatives, whether it's transportable transportable GBIs or something like that. I would say, however, that the GBIs are pretty big, quite a bit larger than the old Nikes from the 1950s.
Yeah, everybody look that up for those of you who don't know that. And last question, how does there's work underway. The Aegis system does have that exo-atmospheric capability as well, which is aboard the U.S. Navy's cruisers and destroyers, some of which have been modified for the ballistic missile defense mission. You do have THAAD and Patriot. That's much more for our allies, much closer in, sort of a theater defense system. But talk to us about the architecture, about how some of these networks are all being stitched together, because we're using some radars that are long-range radars that are based in Japan to give us that early. There are space-based assets associated with this, but also there's a way for the Navy to be able to play into this as well, given its very capable, very mobile, extremely high-altitude interception capability.
You've clearly been reading our report, throwing around exo-atmospheric, this, that, and the other.
I've been covering missile defense since 1992,
I know.
so.
But I would just say, I think that the development over the past couple decades of these systems, you very rightly point to I would say, commonality between the exo-atmospheric kill vehicles on the Aegis and the exo-atmospheric kill vehicles on the GMD. All right, so there's a lot of commonality there. They very different characteristics as well. But I think that over the last couple decades, you've really seen a lot of maturity and growth of the capabilities across the 4 families: Patriot, THAAD, Aegis, and GMD. And that's why each of those have their own separate characteristics. But this larger ballistic missile defense system, the BMDS, there's a lot of connectivity, a lot of connective tissue and commonality. And every time you learn something from Aegis, it might transfer over in some way to the algorithms for GMD and vice versa. So we've been learning a lot over the past decades, and I think it's very impressive. And when you see the intercept like we did this week, it's pretty satisfying.
Tom, thanks so very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.